Okay, well, thank you. And Eric said that we've got speakers for the rest of the year. If you haven't been involved with the, actually, show of hands, how many people is this year like your first research triangle analyst doodad? 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a technical term. I didn't mean to throw you off. So 4 new people. Welcome. Welcome everybody else too. But so the way we usually do things is 10 months of the year we have stuff, right? Monthly lunches. We have monthly talks. What's that? And except in March we have a conference, and we take December off because no one's doing anything in December anyway. And in November, instead of like serious talking time, we have like basically drinking and snacking time, which is much nearer and dear to my heart, but that's besides the point. So the way that we usually get speakers is people have some topic, some cool thing that they've done. Maybe it's for work, maybe it's a side project, and they call Eric, or they call Melinda, or they email me because I don't answer my phone anymore, and we get them on the schedule. When that doesn't happen, when you have a hole in the middle of the summer where no one is available to speak, then Eric starts tearing out his hair, and I don't tear out my hair because there's none left to tear. I pull all that out, and then eventually I say, okay, I'll tell you what, I will throw myself on that grenade and talk about whatever, right? So this one's Linda's fault. At the wait, this is you. Literally at the Analytics Forward conference, I just turned the thing off, so there goes my helpful visual aid. I gave some talk about something. I don't remember, sorry. But in the middle, I had some throwaway comment about there's things you can do for unsupervised variable selection, and we don't have time to get into that now, which is what I always say when I'm not sure how to answer a question. And Linda came up afterwards, she's like, why did you pitch that? That would have been much more interesting than the garbage you just said. And I was like, well, she didn't say that, but like you could tell.
She applied.
And so I cried, and then I was like, no, you know what, I'll plan on doing that at some point. And I would have probably done that at another time, but then I got the email from Eric that said, what are you going to do next week? I was like, oh, I know. This. So, and
the email was actually, I'm on vacation, you guys figure it out.
I was like, it'd be much harder to find somebody to give a talk than to just figure something to talk about for an hour. And that's how you know you're an introvert. If you'd rather sit down and write a talk than ask somebody else to do it. Maybe you're an introvert. Anyway, so just kind of show of hands, people who are like data science-y, statistical, analyst-y, I don't know what they're calling them these days, machine learning, something. All right, and people who are otherwise employed in the data arts, like data manipulation, data gymnastics. And anybody who didn't raise their hand, can you kind of like just give me a shout what it is that brought you here?
Security.
Security. Security brought you here?
Cybersecurity.
He got past security.
Usually security's taking people out. That's entirely different. Yeah. There's a funny story about that I'll tell you at my retirement party. But there's a gag order until then. So if you're not familiar with this jargon, I apologize. The unsupervised part does not mean that Eric puts me in front of a microphone and lets me jabber. Unsupervised means that I have a classification task typically, and my cases are not already labeled, right? So I don't have a teacher telling me that these folks pay their bills as agreed, and these folks don't pay their bills as agreed, or these people respond to junk mail, and these people don't respond to junk mail. I don't have those labels. If I did have those labels, then it would be supervised variable selection. That's a different talk for the next time no one volunteers to give a talk. But if you don't have those labels, or if, more likely, you have so many of them you don't know what to do, so you ignore them for the time being, then you get unsupervised variable selection. So the question becomes, how could I take a wide data set with a lot of columns and reduce it down to a less wide data set, intermittent fasting, right? Reduce it to a less wide data set that doesn't necessarily throw away any more information than is absolutely necessary. So if I have 100 columns, and I guess the point of putting the slides together was to have other things to point at than these words. If you don't know, I'm certainly not going to tell you, it's not like a passive aggressive, I'm fighting with my wife kind of thing. It's like, I don't even, if you ever were in a conversation that went that way, and if you don't know my wife, you're missing out, she's a lovely woman. Hi, sweetie. Wave to the camera, because she's going to look this up on YouTube now, thanks. You know, if you had labels, then you would know, right? But if you don't know, then what do you do, right? How do you say, I can't carry all these hundreds or thousands or kajillions of columns around to, but I still want to know, in some sense, the information that's in that data set. So data set's too wide, right? And I like the R and R thing here, so I don't think I invented this, but I'll pretend like I did. The people will say multicollinearity, right? What's the problem with the data set that's too wide? Multicollinearity, what does that mean? I don't actually know, but it's fun to say, and it's lots of syllables, and it makes me sound like paying for my master's degree was not a waste of money. But at the end of the day, the biggest bugaboos about multicollinearity are either that a lot of the columns that I'm carrying around aren't relevant for my purposes. Again, typically predicting who's going to pay their loans or not pay their loans, who's going to respond to junk mail or not respond to junk mail. I cut my teeth in banking, so I apologize if all my examples are about like being a cutthroat capitalist kind of guy. I left eventually because you can't wear sandals and ponytails to the banks for very long. If you lose your hair, you can't wear ponytails anymore anyway. That's a different problem. But so the relevancy is more about supervised variable selection, right? Does the variable tell me about the classification task that I have in mind? But redundancy is all on the x side of the equation, right? Y equals x1 through x infinity. Redundancy is all about just the x piece. So this is a little joke. If these bullets look stupid, it's an old Simpsons gag. So Bart Simpson goes on television and he has a tagline, right? I forget what his tagline was because those synapses. I didn't do it. So say the line, Bart. I didn't do it. Say the line, Bart. Everyone wants him to repeat the line over and over and over again. And then finally, he pushes back. He feels silly that he's always saying the same thing over and over again. And he realizes he has this breakthrough, right? Being repetitive is my job. It's my job to be repetitive. Being repetitive is my job. So the problem with redundancy is that there's repetition in your data, there's no new information in your data, and there's redundancy in your data. That's a little killer. Your data sets, this is a little throwaway, your data sets are probably also tall, right? No judgment, right? But like, if you came here, you're probably thinking about why data sets, there's a lot of variables, too many to look at. When you're like, I know, I'll print out the data dictionary, and then the printer starts, and then like keeps going, and then someone comes waiting for something they printed, and they look at you, and you're like, I just wanted the dictionary, I just wanted the list of variables, and it's, you know, so you probably got a wide data set. You can't just like take the dictionary home and thumb through it and do this kind of redundancy trimming by hand. And you got to think a little bit about what it is you're going to do, because if your data set is also very tall, then there's, you know, that's n, right? And all the algorithms that are going to do things around like correlations and covariances and stuff are the big O or little o or like medium size O of n squared or n cubed or something terrible. So it's not like I can just say, no problem, I'll just do this thing that sounds reasonable to a casual acquaintance because it might run until the heat death of the universe, at which point in time no one's going to care anymore. This is my data dictionary, right? I had to unfreeze my credit recently because I had to freeze my credit recently. And if you go to Experian or if you go to Equifax, TransUnion, whoever, right? Anybody that sells you data will be more than happy to tell you about the, you know, litany of variables that you can buy from them, right? I don't know. Hopefully, you've never been in a position where you had to like buy credit bureau data, because that's what made me leave the bank. So this is the large print. This is another little joke. I apologize. It's terrible. This is the large print. These are all the variables we can sell you. And I don't mean to pick on Experian. If you work for Experian, I'm sure they're like lovely people and everything. I could have done with this with Equifax. If I had time, I would have doctored the logo so the colors were different, and it was called like, you know, Dan Bank Incorporated or something. But I'm slow. So instead, no, I'm just begging forgiveness. So they'll tell you all these variables that you can have. But up here, these are the lyrics from Tom Waits' song Step Right Up, where if you scroll about 2/3 of the way through, you get, receive our free brochure. Read the easy to follow assembly instructions, battery not included, send before midnight, step right up. The large print giveth, and the small print taketh away. And that is like the fundamental truth about these data dictionaries, right? They're going to tell you, oh, I'll sell you all the data in the world, right? I'll tell you everything you want to know about anything. And where's the end button? I'm skipping to the end. La la la, there's pictures of hippopotami. Get excited. With the data that they actually send you, the data dictionary looks like this, where I know you can't read this, and you're not even supposed to. The point is, this block looks like it's the same words over and over and over again. And they're charging you a dime each. Every 1,000 people, this piece of information is going to cost you 10 cents or a nickel or whatever. And you're like, okay, if I know how many times they've been 120 days past due, ever, then I probably have a pretty good guess how many times they've been 120 days past due in the last year, or in the last 9 months, or in the last 6 months, or in the last 3 months, or like they tell you, oh, you know, the brochure says we got infinity variables you can have, and really like infinity minus one of them are all the same piece of information, just slightly tweaked. That's a little Cantor said homework. You can go home and figure out whether that's not enough variables or not. So yeah, in case I forgot to tell you, right, a tall data set is going to mean that some things are expensive. So the first thing everybody says, and actually Rick Pack, who's not here, Rick, waving to him in YouTube land. Rick Pack had like the first comment on this talk. When hot off the presses, I said, we'll just do this. And Rick said, oh man, I wish I could be there, because it's probably about principal components analysis and maybe some other stuff. And I was like, I should have just called it that, principal components analysis and maybe some other stuff. So principal components analysis. So you remember what principal components analysis is from like math? It wouldn't be like 201, it'd be like 401. It's something about, you've got a matrix A, and you've got an arbitrary vector x, and A times x is equal to lambda times x, right? So if you're gung-ho about the interpretation of this stuff, which my linear algebra teacher wasn't, so I'm like trying to raise my children, you know, to think about what these matrices mean instead of just, you know, manipulating these things. It's not working, but I'll try. But the idea is that the projection of an arbitrary vector into the column space of your matrix is a rescaling, you know, for the right, is a rescaling. So you get A is your matrix, you get lambda, which are your eigenvalues, right? Which is so great. And from the German, right, for eigenvalue, it's not true. Eigenwert is the German word for eigenvalue. But eigen means to own. In German, the word for a condominium is basically eigen apartment. Which makes sense, right? It's the apartment that you own. So in an eigenvalue is kind of like, it's the own value. The math problem that you're solving, right, is solving for, I guess, all the what is it? X's and lambdas, and you're getting your eigenvectors and your eigenvalues. It lets you say fun German sounding words, right, which is always a good idea. I should have connected to the internet. Instead, I'll maybe make Eric put this up on the meetup page or something. There is, I did do a much more boring talk about only principal component analysis at work a couple years ago, and I found this website. Somebody went through and made like all these little rotatable widgets, which was great because I don't know how to talk about principal components without mashing, whatever I have neatly nearby into kind of a three-dimensional object. If you were going to, let's talk about that in a second. Let's talk about that now. Let's say you had a cloud of data points, right? And you kind of like, if you could grab them and manipulate them and look at them, maybe they'd look kind of like this cool tube thing. Maybe, just to make life interesting, it'd be like sort of a squashy tube, right? So it's not circular on the end, it's ovoid. Is that a word? Eggish shaped, but long this way, right? Of course. So, and then maybe if I could look at it, my cloud of points is kind of just floating out here in space like this. And I think about points in this room. If you were going to sit down and like anybody like a data model type person, you're like, well, okay, if I'm going to record information about the location of points in this room, I'm going to say, how far are you from like left to right, windows to the walls? How far are you from the front to the back of the room, right? And how far are you from the floor to the ceiling, right? Because that's convenient for me to think about. I'm going to call it X, Y, and Z or something, right? Or up, down, left, right, and front, back. And then I'm going to throw stuff around. You're in the splash zone, right? It's like Gallagher. The watermelon's in the car. I forgot. But if I had this cloud of points here, there's no guarantee that just because thinking about X and Y and Z makes it easy for me to think about each of those columns independently, that those things have anything to do with the fundamental dimensions of this object, this thing, this cloud of points, right? My little, whatever you call the shape. Ovoid prism. It's a technical term. But if you could grab this thing and absent yourself from the conversation about the room and just say, here's the data that we have. This is what we've got going on. And really, if I could only know one thing about this cloud of points, I'm probably going to want to know this long one, right? And then slightly less important, but probably maybe also important, is this dimension, right? And if I know those two things, I probably know pretty much everything about where you are in this cloud. But just to be like complete, maybe I could also record this itty bitty, the squished axis. So there's kind of two ways to think about it. You can put your foot down and say, I'm going to talk about X, Y, and Z because that's how I think about this stuff. Or you could look at what's actually out there and say, all right, I'm going to think about kind of the long axis, the medium axis, and the tiny axis. So that's what this extremely wordy bullet point is there to say, right? Usually when we're going to put together a database, we're thinking about what do I want to record, what do I want to know, what individual nugget of information might someone be interested in, not if I went out there and took a representative sample of the universe, where would the data points actually lie? And to be fair, right, I don't know, right? What would I call this longest axis if I had to give it a name, right? Like slanty front-ish, left-ish corner to slanty back-ish, top-ish, right-ish corner. Like I don't know what I would call that. I don't know how I would explain that to Fred from marketing when I said, hey Fred, I've got big news. We're only going to target people who have high slanty left-ish to right-ish, whatever. He wants to know we're going to target little old ladies who have a lot of money. I don't know if you know Fred, but his real name's Phil, but I changed his name so he'll never know. And that's what he liked. He liked rich old women. The older I get, the more it makes sense, right? But that's besides the point. So principal components analysis kind of turns the problem around and says, let's not worry so much about the individual names of components here. The things that we actually wrote down. Let's look at the data and have that kind of instruct us about what components are actually going on. The long one, the medium one, the skinny one. And the reason that I didn't just talk about principal components the whole time is that probably probably the reason that you're doing some kind of unsupervised variable selection, right, kind of ignoring the target, it might be that someone's paying you cash money to like just look at a big data set and kind of tell them what's going on. That might happen, right? I don't know. If it happens a lot, call me, because that sounds fun. But probably it's, like when I was at the bank, I had this monster database of all the information we had about all our card holders and whoever. And then we had all these targets that we were going to have to predict. I needed to know who was going to respond to junk mail. If they responded, were we going to offer them a card? If we, because if you didn't do pre-screening, right? You're like, please, 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 please have my credit card. And you say yes, and I'm like, never. Are you kidding me? I would never. And which is like the Groucho Marx version of credit scoring. I would never be a member of a credit union that would have me as a member. So we had all these targets, right? We had, would you respond to the mail at all? If you respond to the mail at all, would we approve you for the card? After the fact, if we approve you for the card, are you going to use it? If you use it, do you pay the loan back as agreed? Like there's all these targets. So if you're, I was going to say lazy, but that's going to sound wrong. If you're like enterprising and you don't like to duplicate effort, maybe you say, I'll go to the database and I'll get a skinny list of the variables that seem to represent most of what's going on in the whole database. And then when I go to do my marketing model, my approval model, my risk model, whatever, 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 I can use my skinny file and not have to do so much effort at the time of supervised variable selection, because I can do some of it up front. So why are you telling me the story, Dan? Well, my point is, you can say as like a neat math problem, haha, I have deduced that there are 3 components going on here, and this is obviously an important component, right? So big, right? This one may be important because it's like kind of big-ish, but this guy, meaningless, right? Discard it, throw it away. But like that, there's no guarantee that this isn't the dimension that carries all the information about a particular target that you're interested in, right? And that's why I like doing this with paper, right? Because like I can roll it up and whatever, and you say, oh, of course, like it's not going to matter, but this page is entirely different from that page, right? So like it's if you're doing this as a means of getting rid of information when in the future you're going to have to answer further questions, then just they call it a scree plot, right? You get this thing that looks like a bunch of gravel, and people say, oh, I'm going to go down to some arbitrary point, and I'll take all the components up to that point, and I'll throw away everything after that, and that's cool if you don't have to do anything afterwards. But if you're being a little conservative, then in the sense of conserving things, if you don't want to throw away potentially useful information unnecessarily, then you probably don't want to just do that on its own. This was in case I forgot to bring paper that I could roll up. But when I Googled rolled up paper images, which is exactly what I did there, all of a sudden I started having like this legal nightmare of like, if I steal one of these pictures, what am I going to do? So I took a screenshot of the Google search, and now my lawyer says I'm good. And now we like take a breather while we call my lawyer and find out how much trouble I'm actually in. The PCA kind of cautionary tale from the end of the last slide is like, first of all, you might have thrown away a principal component that you were going to need for a particular target. The other issues are a little more practical. First of all, talking to Fred, right? Telling Fred that instead of, rich versus poor and young versus old, now all of a sudden I have to know kind of this weird slanty variable that I made up. I'm never going to get that by Fred. If I get it by Fred, there's probably an internal compliance officer who's going to be like, what are you talking about, like weird slanty variable? That doesn't mean anything to me. I'm not going to let you put that model in place, because when the officer, the comptroller, or the currency comes, I don't know if anybody's a banker, but OCC is like the scariest 3 letters in the world. Didn't work. The Office of the Comptroller of Currency is these guys, right? It's key. Justice, right? Like
They will lock your doors.
Whether you're in there or not. But like their job is to make sure you're not doing stuff like being, hey, you know who's really good at paying their bills? Rich old women. So let's target them for our credit card. Because like you can't do that. The Fair Credit Reporting Act says you're not allowed to just do that. I needed a picture for the OCC because I figured not everybody would know who that was. When I went to the website to get the picture, this is what popped up. And I was like, they know! I thought they knew I was going to be teasing about them. And I was like, oh no. But this is about, the rain in Louisiana and stuff. But that was very scary for me. And I told you, right, that's the scariest 3 letters. If you build a model to determine who gets a loan, and credit cards count, and you're using a variable like, God help you, gender, age, like there's some protected information. These guys will randomly show up on your door, and they'll ask to see all of the information about how you built that model and why you built that model. So, long story short, those guys are unpleasant. The people whose responsibility is to get yelled at by them when you do something wrong are even more unpleasant because they're trying to protect themselves from that unpleasantness. So if you can't just say, no, yeah, it's the number of times you were late paying your mortgage in the last 3 years, times some weight, plus the number of times that would ever happen. Like if I can use those terms, then Fred's happy, hopefully compliance is happy, and nobody gets the red triangle scariness. And this piece is just about ease of scoring. This has nothing to do with math. This is, well, I'm sure it does, right? There's all zeros and ones down there. But like, practically speaking, I'm going to get some nugget of code, and maybe it's 1,000 lines, maybe it's 100,000 lines, maybe it's some gigantic file of score code. And if I'm like, oh, I'm so clever, by using this thing, I just need a weight times principal component number 1, plus a weight times principal component number 2, plus a different weight times principal component number 3, and instead of 300 variables, I just use those first 3 linear combinations, except, if you remember your principal components analysis, that first principal component is some weight times x1, plus some weight times x2, plus some weight times x2. So you got to carry the creation of these guys around as part of your scoring code, and it's just super tedious. This doesn't stand for anything. These are not the scariest 3 letters. It's God, like what am I supposed to do now? Because I gotta have this, I'm a SAS guy, so in my head, this is all data step code. I gotta carry around, data new, set old, PC1 equals 5 times x1 plus 2 times whatever, and the odds that all of those pieces of code get carried around appropriately are probably low. This is the awesome code example, so we can talk about writing code. This is my favorite part though. Everybody know what language, I'm not going to pronounce this, but that thing, W-Y-S-T-E-P-U-J-E. Okay, this is the cautionary tale. This is the Polish word for feature. Right, so we're talking about feature selection and variables and whatever. So I was like, cool, right? How great is this? First of all, like, what are the odds that you pull a random screenshot of code off the internet and it's, it's not Java, it's Polish, right? It's the other part that I liked about this picture is, does anybody know what encoding Polish uses? It's not like a quiz.
UTF-8.
Right. Polish has this one character that looks like an L, but it isn't an L. It's an L with like a slash through it. And that thing's not in Latin 1. There's one of these, what is that, 8? One of these 8 guys is like the ASCII art version of an actual valid Polish character. So like, you've got to help you, right? Like your code might get shipped off to Stanistan somewhere, and all of a sudden nothing works because you're not even in the right alphabet. So anyway, that's other reasons to pick on poor old principal component analysis is it's not variable reduction if you have to hang on to everything, and to calculate the principal components you have to hang on to everything. And this one we already talked about, right? That teeny tiny axis might be the one that's interesting. We already made the ham-handed remarks about pages in a book, right? So we don't have to pause. what if, right? How are we doing so far? Very boring? Very interesting? Not making sense at all?
It's about to get interesting.
Okay, it's ish, right? Ish, interesting-ish. So what if, I forget if I found a good picture of Goldilocks in here. I really got, there it is. Oh no, okay. I tried to find a picture of like Goldilocks and Three Bears, because like every time I wind up having one of these conversations, it's always about like, this porridge is too hot. This porridge is too cold. You know, I'm driving you nuts, I'm sorry, internet people. This porridge is just right. The variable, the supervised variable selection a lot of times is like I'll start with a very simple model, intercept only, or like a root node of a tree. This porridge is too cold, right? I'll build a model that learns everything it can about the training sample, and now I'm overfit, and this porridge is too hot. So like somewhere in between, this porridge is just right. Well, what if I could do some kind of restriction on principal components where like, I only want to keep all of the variables, so that porridge is too hot. Right? Okay, well I'm going to throw away everything. Well, that porridge is too cold. How do I step in between so that I can think about different sets of variables that make sense to human beings and not just like math majors, that kind of make some sense about left to right in the room, front to back in the room, top to bottom. So what if we impose some kind of constraint on the inputs, right? If you show up in, if you have a non-zero weight, right, let's be, not show up, but if you have a non-zero weight on one of these principal component style components, that's it. You don't get to be in anything else. You don't get, you get 0 as your weight on every other of these artificially constructed components. And if you're, again, if you're good at linear algebra, which I never was, you can think about that as saying, take your weird blob of data wherever it happens to be, and figure out, for all intents and purposes, which component, I'm sorry, this is the component, which one of these variables that you've already got the name of is kind of most highly correlated, if we can play a little fast and loose with the jargon, with that longest axis. And then when I say, okay, fine, front to back of the room is most highly correlated with this axis, then I need to say, okay, given that, how do I decompose the rest of the noise in my blob? But what you wind up with is sets of variables that are ideally highly correlated with one another and not correlated with the variables that are in any other set. Another way to think about this is, so I probably should have explicitly said this, but I only had one slide about principal components, so what are you going to do? Principal components are constructed to be linearly independent from one another. Those artificial components that we make, it's this long guy, and then subject to the constraint that it's perfectly orthogonal to the long guy, what's the longest axis I can find, and that's this guy. And then subject to the constraint that I'm perfectly orthogonal to those two, what's the next longest axis I can find, and that's this tiny squishy guy in the middle. What if I relaxed that constraint a little bit and said, I don't need everything to be perfectly orthogonal. I don't need all these constructed components to be perfectly orthogonal to each other. I just need them to be essentially, if they're associated with one another, I want to make a component, and then I'll take other variables, 0 weights on the first set of variables, and I'll put non-zero weights on another set of variables, and I want them to be close to orthogonal. I'm not going to like mathematically enforce orthogonality. I'm going to just, it seems like every time I'm talking to this group, I'm saying the word orthogonality. Does anybody remember what orthogonality means? Right angles, right? Who said I like, so yeah, right angles. So ortho, right, like orthodox, right? The right law. Ortho, and gon, like polygons or many angles. Orthogon is right angles. So what if instead of imposing this perfect orthogonality constraint that my components all have to be completely linearly independent of one another, But if I said I don't actually need that, as long as the components that I get are mostly independent of one another. It's a Princess Bride thing, right? It's as we all know, mostly independent
Dan?
and slightly alive.
Do you try to maximize and say, if you had a constraint, but that constraint could be applied to multiple groups, to multiple components, you try to find out which one you maximize, the one it contributes to the most, or you just take the first one you find,
right,
and say we found one, we're moving on.
No, that's a great question. So, and like anytime you move away from that nice clear-cut objective function of like I'm going to insist orthogonality and then do the thing, right? Then there's only one thing to worry about. And when you start saying, well, I'll relax that constraint if I can get some of this, right? So the tool that I've always used for this, again, I mentioned I'm a stats guy. There's a procedure in the stat module, the statistics module, called varclust, which is variable clustering. There's no apostrophe or anything. It's just short. And because I'm not a computer science guy, I think about, okay, well, I'll start with my k variables, and there's like 2 to the k minus 1 or something ways to, or maybe over 2. That's where the minus 1 comes from. To separate all those variables into 2 different sets, and if and voila. Can I use the whiteboard, Chris?
Yes.
It's a sanctioned activity. Let me pull it right here so the camera doesn't pick it up. We're not worried about it. So if you had x1, x2, xk, right? You could, it's never going to show up anyway. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that red isn't showing.
The red isn't showing up. Okay, so let's try again. You got x1, x2, xk, and that's your gigantic wide set of variables, and you want to split them up into, well, eventually you want to set them up in like p, groups, but I'm going to start with just kind of 2 groups, and let's say x1, x2, and x7 show up in my left-hand side, and everybody else shows up in the right-hand side. Now again, right, computationally there's some nightmare possible ways to split these up into 2 groups, right? It's like if you
K
had
things taken P at a time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, but it's 2 to the whatever because it's K light switches, right? And some of them are up and some of them are down. And there's redundancy because if I put the first half up and the second half down, that's the same clustering solution as if I put the first half down and the second half up. But so it's like 2 to the k minus 1 or something ridiculous like that. So we're probably not actually going to do this, but we can use this as kind of a thought experiment. If I took this partition of the variables, and this is basically my understanding of what varclust does. You can look at a principal component analysis of these 3 guys, and you can look at a principal component analysis of these k minus 3 guys, however many that is. And if so this is, I promise this is fun. You just gotta think about it. Nobody cares what the Crivens. I should have back all the way up. So does anybody know? Man, this is why I should have more slides about principal component analysis. So your eigenvalues, right, are essentially related to the length of the components, right? So there's large eigenvalues is why it's supposed to come with a limerick. There's large eigenvalues, there's small eigenvalues. And when I was talking earlier about largest components and smallest components, usually they explicitly talk about that as the magnitude of these eigenvalues. And the sum of the eigenvalues is, the average eigenvalue is 1, for sure. So it's ready. Let's do I equals. This is why I was bad at linear algebra. I never put enough notation on the word. So if I had k variables to start with, and let's say there's no linear dependencies among those k variables, then the sum of my k eigenvalues is k, which is neat, because that gives people a shorthand that, like, the math people always tell me is wrong, but every practitioner I know insists on using it anyway, where they say, oh, there's 3 variables in this group, and I did a principal component analysis, and the eigenvalue is, 1.55 in this direction, and this length is like 1.45, and because, or let's just say 1.4, because there's 3 variables, and this plus the teeny tiny it's technical term component that's sort of in this third dimension here, that adds up to 3, then people always wind up saying, oh, so that first component's like 1.55 variables worth of information. That second component's like 1.4 variables worth of information. Over here, let's say that I had, 12 variables in here. This first eigenvalue might be like 11.6, and this guy is going to be 0.4. So even if I took these 12 variables and I just pulled the first principal component out of it, that's going to explain 11.6 variables worth of information. And again, if I were like a hardcore pure math guy, I might know why people always get mad when you say that in a math class, when everyone I've ever met does say it in this context. But so if you have a set of variables, and so let's say, what did I say? I had 12 over here, I had 3 over here, so I know I solved for k. Congratulations, great job. So that means that I would get 15 eigenvalues if I did a full-blown principal component analysis on this this wide data set. And I'd get 15 numbers that would sum up to 15. And if those 15 components were all perfectly already linearly independent of one another, right? It's your height and the number of letters in your mother's maiden name and the 6th digit of your social security number, like all these things that should be pretty much independent of one another, then all those artificial components that you make up are independent of one another, but all these variables were already independent of one another anyway, so you wind up with basically a bunch of lambdas all near 1. If it's like the data that the credit bureau wants to sell you, where you've got the number of times you were 30 days past due in the last 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, year, 2 years, ever. The number of times you were 60 days past due in the last 90 days, 120 days, 180 days. Like you get this list of variables that are all really telling you one thing about whether or not you can get a check in an envelope before the due date. Then I wind up with like there's one component really going on, and everything else is just noise, right? Either you're good at paying your bills and you screwed up one time, or you're good at paying your bills and you screwed up not at all, or you're not as good at paying your bills. So a setup like this guy might make me think that even though I had 12 variables in this set, there's not really 12 unique pieces of information in there. There's one piece of information in there and 11 repetitive, redundant, and redundant pieces of garbage that I can get rid of. And then over here, I have these 3 components, or these 3 variables, x1, x2, and x7, and maybe I'd like to think that I could discard most of them, because like I did so well, throwing away 11 out of 12 over there. But here, looking at this, when I do like a little principal component analysis of just this subset of variables, I see that I'm still spanning, for all intents and purposes, I'm spanning 2 dimensions, right? There's still something else going on. If I pick my most favorite variable out of this set, there's still guaranteed to be something else going on in there, some other information there. Does that make any sense? Okay. Some nodding. That's promising. Because I've now been huffing markers since Mark asked this question, so I need to try and remember what his question was so that I can. Okay. Yes. Okay. Nothing magic about x1, x2, and x7.
Yeah.
Except for the fact that, of course, 127 is 2
To the eighth
one.
one.
Yeah. 7 ones in a row.
Yeah.
So there's nothing magic about that set, nothing magic about the balance, right, the other set. So try it again, right? Try it by splitting the data. You could, if you're naive and foolish like me, then maybe you just spend a lot of time. Like, okay, how many 2 cluster solutions can I get to? And then, of course, these partitioning problems are just the worst because once I get to a solution for this 2-way split, now I got to figure out what I'm going to do with this guy, right? But there's some heuristics. There's probably some theory built in that I don't know about. There's also some heuristics built in that I don't know about either, which is why you guys need to volunteer to give talks so that someone who knows what they're talking about will come up and do this stuff. But the upshot of the deal is, if I do for any one of these sets that I have, any one of these sets of variables that I have, if I do a principal components analysis, and I know the first principal component is always going to be greater than or equal to 1. That's literally just math, right? So the length of this guy is totally always going to be at least 1. So that's not really interesting. The interesting question for me is this Goldilocks question of, do I need to split a cluster further, or can I leave it alone, right? Assuming that the great goddess Statistica came down from her diamond throne and gave me a reasonable partition of variables to begin with. For every one of these splits, I have to answer the question, do I split further, or do I leave it alone? The answer is going to show up in purple. It comes down to not this first eigenvalue, because we know that the length of the first eigenvalue is always going to be at least 1. That's totally boring. The question is, if I got rid of that first component, if I did some amazing job of kind of replicating the piece of information captured by that first principal component, is there anything left, right? So like I was eating donuts all morning, and now I want to know, right? Like, is there anything left in there? Over here, right? Whatever. There's plenty of information in one direction, but there's nothing left, right? I'm arbitrarily deciding that an eigenvalue of 0.4 means that there's nothing left. But if you'll let me wave my hands at that for a second, then I just say there's nothing left here. So no, I'm not going to bother splitting this guy because there's only one dimension in this group anyway. So forget about it, right? Like we did it. Good job. Mission accomplished. But these guys over here, 1, 2, 3 variables worth of information. The first one, of course, the first one represents at least 1 variable worth of information. That's what the math always says. Boring. But like, how about the second guy? So literally, the stopping criterion is that for every group of variables that you have as a result of this variable clustering, you test whether the maximum, you test whether the second eigenvalue, the second largest eigenvalue, is big. Technical term, right? Big. And I'll get there. And if the second eigenvalue is big enough, then you say there's probably more than 1 variable's worth of information trapped in this set of variables, and so I must, right? I must split this guy further, and so I wind up with one of the variables over here and everybody else over there, and then the next question is, let's say I put x3 over here, x1, x2 here. How would I decide if I can?
X7.
Oh, it's a test. Excellent work. This is So yeah, exactly. So, and again, right, the partitioning test, maybe there's a heuristic, maybe there's some like mathematical thing I can do about correlations or something to be smart about it. But if you'll let me split them, then how do I decide, this is a test, how do I decide whether I can leave x1 and x2 together as like basically one variable's worth of information in there, or I have to split them? How do I decide? The same way that I decided over here. The same way that I decided over here. I say, let me do principal components on this group of variables. It's a pretty boring group, right? But if I do principal components on these guys, and I get the first principal component is 2 and the second principal component is 0, then that means these guys are perfectly linearly correlated. If I do principal components on them and the first eigenvalue is 1 and the second eigenvalue is 1, that means they're perfectly independent, probably belong in the same cluster to begin with, whatever. So I'm going to do some kind of, straight up do principal components on these two variables and see what the second eigenvalue is. And if it's big, then I'll split, because there's not just one piece of information in here. If the second eigenvalue is small, then I won't split, because there is, for all intents and purposes, just one piece of information in this bucket of variables. There's a cute, it's not cute, it's very like mathematically awesome. There's a, if you run the var class procedure, you can get, and this is just an example that you'd be able to read, right? When you do this with a real wide data set, you get, essentially spaghetti for the variable names. But it's this same kind of idea. So for each variable that you have, see, I knew I was going to be in front of a screen there. So I could say, maybe I only want 2 clusters, right? Maybe I only want 2 variables to choose from. So I'll pick a cutoff over here. I should have rotated this probably, but like kind of lean to the right. And it's just sort of like a tree, right? So I've got all my variables are in one cluster here. So I could just say, give me one variable out of the whole data set. That would speed up every analysis after the fact, right? Because you just have to check whether one variable has anything to do with anything, but you might not get answers that would keep you employed. So if I said, okay, well let me split into 2 groups, then you get, and this is unsupervised, right? There's no like text analysis going into like, oh, chest width is probably related to chest girth. Like, no, you've got actual chest measurements in a data set, and you run through this gobbledygook with the principal components, and they wind up on this side of the set of variables. So your chest measurements, overall weight, and whatever the heck that thing is, I should have probably looked that up beforehand. That's embarrassing, but whatever. Whatever that is, seems like it's going to be correlated with those guys, some kind of diameter. And then up here is forearm length, leg length, that kind of stuff. So it's neat. Right? If I was going to just say, give me 2 pieces of information out of all these body measurements, I get fundamentally, I promise, Scout's honor, I didn't like cook this ahead of time. I get stuff about width and stuff about length, right? Which is funny. I think that's neat. When you do that with, I forget where my big slide went here, not the hippo. When you do that with this guy, right? I've seen this happen 100, well, maybe actually 100 times. Even though I don't tell it what the variables are named aside from to point out which column in the data set is, a lot of these are going to show up in the same clusters because they're highly correlated. If you know one of them, you've got a really good guess about what any of the other ones are. So if you decompose that set of variables into one component, there's very little information orthogonal to that component. And I have no idea what time it is, I'm sorry. Holy cribbins, it's 8 o'clock. What time are we supposed to leave? 12? Oh, great. What's that? 8 o'clock.
Sooner rather than later.
Okay, so Goldilocks, right? This porridge is too cold, this porridge is too hot. How do I decide kind of the right amount? And this is what you get when you look up Goldilocks cartoons that don't have legal restrictions associated. It's a New Yorker cartoon where the dad is saying, we're in the bear's house. Goldilocks is just eating the porridge. Papa Bear enters. I don't know if it's supposed to be a Hemingway thing or what, but
Dad is a dungeon master.
Dad's a dungeon master. Awesome. Right. So, no. Let's put the silver, no, the wooden stake through the heart of this thing. So, this picture, right? You get kind of two questions. If the porridge is too cold, and then you're gonna walk, and then the porridge is too hot, right? Somewhere between is the right answer. The questions become, where do I stop splitting? So that's when I said big, right? You looked at me like, define big, Kelly. I'll get there. I promise. I will. And then, if I decide to stop somewhere other than this edge of the picture, then that implicitly gives me sets of variables. So let me do my amazing. Where's little doodad? This gonna work? Let's say I draw a line there. It's a crappy line. Let's say I draw a line there, so it's a little less ambiguous. That's still pretty ambiguous. But if I draw a line there, I'm going to have three separate clusters where chest width is one thing, girth, weight, and diameter are all together, and then all these length things are together, right? This line is part and parcel of the conversation about deciding how big is, right? If I were a rule to stop based on the eigenvalues, then I would stop splitting at some point along this way here. So if you have a business reason to say, thou shalt always have 37 variables, then you can say split until I get 37 and then stop, because that's more than enough for anybody. If I wanted to kind of have a data-based way to look at it, there's a stopping criterion that's actually based on the magnitude of this second eigenvalue. You can say split until the second eigenvalue in a cluster. It doesn't have to be a two-variable cluster. It could be any one of these. When that's small enough that I believe there's nothing else going on there. And in my example, I picked those numbers arbitrarily, but 0.4 is pretty small. 0.4 variables worth of information. If I can tell you all but 0.4 variables worth of information by just taking one component out of this set of variables, it's probably close enough, right? What would you pick? If you had to pick like a number of variables worth of information as the threshold between small and large, as the threshold between there is some information left in this group of variables versus there isn't.
Usually take Pareto rule to 80%.
So there you go. I could say 80, and that might be even based on the number of clusters, right? The Pareto principle, 80.
80-20. Yeah,
80% of the work is done by 20% of the variables. So maybe I could just say, give me 20% of the variables. They're actually, I should have written this down because I don't know how to pronounce it. You can actually find a reference by somebody named Joliffe, Jolliffe. I can send you the name, where he had an argument from sampling variance, where he said, if you're like a psychometrician and you're used to thinking about these kinds of things, oh, you are.
I was.
I should have put you on the spot.
I was.
So what would you pick?
Well, I guess I have two rules. One is I like 0.5 as a good rule of
Okay.
thumb because that's telling you that eigenvalue represents less than, as you said, less than half of one variable.
Yep.
But the other critical factor is, like, I think you made a very good point in saying that principal components may not reduce your data set or your need for all of those variables if every variable loads on that principal component, if every variable is used to create that principal component. So the second question is not how many variables or what that threshold is, but how many components will maybe get me to 50% of the variance.
Right.
What do I have to do to get it?
And I've heard the item thing too.
That's
I hear that a lot about the eigenvalue is so if I sum the eigenvalues, or that eigenvalue is items of information.
Mm-hmm.
But the more general thing I hear is that if you sum the eigenvalues and you divide by the number of items, that's the proportion of variance accounted for by that set of eigenvalues, that set of components. And so that might be my rule. But then there's, I think you've also got, with unsupervised models, I think people who have done them, it's a lot more subjective than you're laying out all this subjectivity, which is real in practice. You have to make these decisions, and there's no simple answer.
Right. So
Especially if
much more than a
this is
target.
unsupervised.
right, yeah, and that's you can't be wrong if there's no answer, right? So finally, my time to shine. The kind of statistical argument that I've heard is, if I wanted to be like purely abstract about it, I'd be like, well, one, right? If there's less than one variable's worth of information hiding on, in the background, then forget about it, right? It's less than one variable worth of information, or less than a half, or less than whatever. But
With factor analysis, you can even look at item loadings,
Right.
On that
Right.
factor, and you say that at some point the
I mean,
correlation of
that's
that
in
item
loading.
with that pretend latent variable in the universe is so low that it doesn't
Right.
add anything to it, which is, so I don't know, I guess I usually set a threshold, I don't look at anything less than 0.3.
Yeah, no,
Unless
and
I'm
that's-
just fooling around, so it's.
so that's I
nothing
got
other
like
than
one more
0.3.
slide about that.
Yeah, sorry. go ahead.
No, you're good. You're good. I made it this far without saying the word loading. And I was super proud of
Yeah, I'm
myself.
sorry, I
The genie's out of the
apologize,
bottle.
and then I ruined it. They're all loaded,
So-
they're all high, they're all drunk, all those variables are loaded.
So maybe 20% of K, right? As kind of a Pareto principle. Maybe 5 or 1 or some cutoff. The statistical argument I heard was that based on just sampling variability, if you put a cutoff at 1, you're going to screw up just because noise is going to mean you wind up throwing away things. Where the second eigenvalue would have been over 1 if you weren't unlucky in your sample. So he said 0.7. Like the cure for bad luck is to go slightly, so 0.7. But like what was nice about that was it's not Dan says 0.7 is a reasonable value. It's there's like a series of 4 papers by this guy, and so I can say, well, the Joe-Leaf criterion is just like the maximum second eigenvalue of 0.7, and that draws the red line for you. So other approaches, because you said 3 hours left. You pick more than just the first component or accounting for the near misses. Because the next question is, if I did pick, okay, this cluster is easy, right? Picking the best representative from this cluster is easy. What am I going to do with these 3 variables? If I do principal components and take the first component, that's arguably the bestest piece of information I can get from these 3 variables, but I still have to explain principal components to Fred, and he's not going to like it. And appears even worse. There are 4 variables that I got to reduce down. So that's the very last slide. Is what are you going to do when you get these clusters of variables? How are you going to pick your favorite one? So that's what you're wondering about. Okay. But so picking more than just the first component, maybe we'll talk about that in a second. Accounting for near misses. So I have a patent on an unsupervised variable selection routine. Me and a buddy of mine from work. He's the first author. So I thought, let me find my patent. And I'll show it to everyone. So I went to Google Patents and I searched for my own name. And I skipped the first one because it was kind of PG-13. But the second one was improvement in boring bits. This is not me, Daniel Kelly, because it was granted July 11th, 1871. But I was like, oh, improving the boring bits. Wouldn't that be freaking amazing if like anybody could do that? But that wasn't it. The actual patent, and this is, he's not on here. Brian's the first author. He came up with the name space dilating two-way variable selection. I was like, what? It sounds awesome. But it basically is, more of this argument about like, well, by bad luck, you might miss a variable that would have been interesting. So can we look at the loadings? Can we look at the actual weights of an individual principal components analysis and try to account for the fact that sometimes you're just not lucky, and you don't want to throw something away if maybe it's on the fence. So picking representatives. This is the very last thing. We saw this a bunch of times because I'm terrible at organizing slides and I had to come here and find it to talk about other stuff. But if you don't read this, right? But if you just kind of squint, you get your Newtonian prism, right? There's no indigo. But the all trades up at the top, I think I had like a smart thing there. You got the red stuff is do you pay your cards on time? The yellow stuff is do you pay your car loans on time? If you put yellow on light gray, I'll kill you, so we'll put yellow on black. Do you pay your car loans on time? How many car loans do you have? How many mortgages do you have? Which is like, What's the balance across all your mortgages? How many mortgages do you pay late, right? How many times do you pay your mortgage late? So really, I don't need this column of variables if I can get to, some representative subset here. How do I pick whether it's this one or this one or this one or this one or this one to represent whichever color that is? That's what the hippopotamus is for. How do I pick a winner in each one of those groups of variables? One way is to cheat, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Like, if you're like a statistician by trade, if you work on like clinical trials, close your eyes and plug your ears for a second because this is not in the protocol. But you could just say, I got 7 variables in a bucket. One of them is going to win the contest of what's the best one variable model out of all the variables in that bucket. Again, things we're not supposed to talk about at parties, but that everybody does. Purchase price. If one of those things is something you calculate yourself on your customers, and another one is something you have to pay Experian for, well, I shouldn't have to tell you, right? The profit system follows the path of least resistance. Following the path of least resistance is what makes the river crooked. No, that's the wrong talk. If you have to buy it in one place and it tells you the same information you can get for free somewhere else, then duh, right? Like, don't buy it. Again, I'm not picking on Experian. I'm sorry, Experian representative watching this in the future. If one thing's easy to calculate, one thing's hard to calculate, right? If it's your average payments versus your max payment or something, right? If God help you, if you have to do this a zillion times, averages are easier than maxes. What else? Magic hippopotamus. Ease of use. If one of these things is going to be easier to explain to Fred, then pick it. Right? Like the 7 variables in the bucket, don't pick the one that's like, oh yes, that's x times the log of x. And it's not log 10, it's like natural log of x. So we got to explain natural logs to Fred real quick to make this make sense. No, you don't. Pick the other one. Pick any other one. Ease of interpretation, same thing, right? If you want to talk about linear models, it's going to be 1 unit changes in something. Let it be 1 unit change on a scale that makes some kind of sense. Ease of convincing people that it works. And then the hippo. Do you know what hippo means? Sounds like somebody does.
Highest paid person's opinion.
Right. Who's the highest paid person in the room and what's their opinion? The highest paid person's opinion. So, high paid person opinion. It's a little joke. So the hippopotamus is there to remind us that, at the end of the day, if it's not Fred from marketing, but it's the CFO who's like, oh, I like X7. You're like, you're darn right you do, and I do too. That's other things I told Eric and Melinda. I would say doing this stuff up front might simplify your life. You have to do a bunch of supervised models. The events per variable thing is about how many questions can I ask my data and expect reasonable answers back. So this is mainly in the medical literature that I've seen it before, but there's literally simulations people have done where they say at 10 or more events, so responders or bad payers or fraud cases or whatever it is that you're interested in, at 10 or more of those events per variable that you're considering in your model, things pretty much behave. When you go lower, like in their simulations, they did 5 events per variable. So you've got 500 cases and 99,500 non-cases, and you check whether any of 10,000 predictors are going to do a good job explaining what's going on, then things tend to break down. Your models behave unwell. So I've seen literature where they say 5 is bad and 10 and up is good. And I had somebody yell at me in class one time that 8 was the magic number. I'm like, I'm sure you're right, but like I can't cite the reference of angry guy in the front of the classroom. That's cost not in dollars, but like literally every time you ask your data a question, you're costing something, right? So you can't just ask questions until you get the answer you want, which is the torturing the data, right? There's this data mining used to be a dirty word, right? You ask the data questions until you get the answer you want. I taught a guy from the FBI one time, and he said, I told him about being careful about multiple comparisons because I'm an old school statistician, and that's torturing the data until it confesses. And he says, exactly, that's what I do. And I was like, no, it's not what you do. It's please no. And at least it was the data, right? And it wasn't like the CIA where they take you to some black site off, Anyway, too much. It's different talk. But National Geographic used to do a thing about zip codes. They would interview people in a particular zip code. They went to the zip code where the FBI headquarters are in West Virginia, and they interviewed him, and he said it. He said to the National Geographic, my job is to torture the data till it confesses. And they printed it. So you can go find the National Geographic from like 2001 or something where they literally talked to a guy from the FBI headquarters. And he doesn't even credit me. He doesn't say, well, Dan Kelly told me to torture the data till it confesses. But this is like being a better detective, right? Instead of just like finding the first little old lady on the street and whipping her until she says that she was the one that kidnapped the Lindbergh baby, you get a good list of suspects, right? Go through and find some set of variables that seem like they might know what's going on, and then you only have to ask them. You don't have to ask everybody. This is the same slide over and over again. Other stupid gotchas, right? You probably, if you have principal component software, if you have this variable clustering tool, right, that's going to take account of non-uniform scales, right? It's not going to put dollars on the same scale as square foot, as the same scale of height, as the same scale of whatever. And if you do this well up front, then it's going to recognize that thing in kilometers is the same information as thing in miles, and it's going to prevent you the embarrassment of presenting to a customer or an internal client that, like, look at this amazing thing I found, that kilometers is pretty much the same thing as miles, because they're not going to not be impressed. And then, let's see, having all the answers means you've been asking boring questions. So, does anybody have boring questions or interesting questions? Or everybody just wants to go drink because it's 20 after 8. No questions?
So I have a question about scaling. So scaling using variance, right? Doing your principal components and then using the principal components to predict. Good idea, bad idea, what you should always do?
So scale them first?
Yeah, so sklearn will automatically scale, variance scale everything.
Yeah.
And then they give you a set of principal components, and most people just take those components and just push them straight into the next model.
Yeah. I think it's similar to if you do some kind of cluster analysis with your unscaled variables, right? Like if you're clustering houses, you're going to have number of baths, not a lot, right? 3, 4, 5, whatever. You're going to have square footage on the order of thousands, and then sale price on the order of probably hundreds of thousands. And so you got to do something. I think most of these tools are going to do something like subtract the mean, divide by the variance, or divide by the standard deviation. And, boom, now everything's standard. If you didn't want to do that, I know a lot of people like range standardization, or some kind of less parametric. So instead of subtracting the mean and dividing by the standard deviation, do you subtract the median, and do you divide by the median absolute deviation or something? So you should be able to switch off the standardization pre-processing if you wanted to do something up front, because that suits your purposes. I get a lot of mileage out of just range, subtract the min, divide by the max. And part of me feels like that's naughty, because if everything's uniform, then you've got like no tails,
Right.
But part of me feels like it works and it's explainable. So, when the stat police come up, you can come get me, copper. But yeah, that's kind of the way I think about that piece of it. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Debbie?
For categorical.
Oh, great question. Yeah. No, don't.
What do you think?
That's a great question. So what do you do if you have categorical inputs? So, all right. This is where I open my mouth and then.
You need a wiper?
So there's a couple things, kind of cheap. There's a couple things. So if you had to try and squeeze categorical data into this, first of all, if you were going to do some kind of supervised classification later on, then there's a bunch of ways that you can take, like, you know, A, B, C, D, and map it to, you know, like the logit in group A, if you're doing logistic regression or something like that. So this, again, totally cheating, right? Like, don't tell the statisticians that we're doing it, but you could do, you know, you could do that, and then this guy now captures the information about these groups, and it also captures information about their relationship with the target. There's like, the next time no one signs up to talk, there's a million reasons why that might not be the best idea, but there's other things that people do to try and get around that. Like if those were the only categories that were a nice size, right, were big enough, what does that mean? Then you might just group everybody else into the other category. And then you can, this is a number, right? You can feed this into all those calculations the same as you wanted. If they mean something, kind of another, the problem that got us here was that our data set was too wide already, but if this was like some kind of sensible grouping of your customers, a lot of times people like zip code, you know, which is like great. I've got a categorical variable with 30,000 levels. We're still friends though. You could go to, I don't know if Experian will sell it to you, but like Axiom would sell you zip level demographics, right? So you could say, ostensibly, zip code's got me 30,000 degrees of freedom that I can't really use because I can't target, you know, 90210. But you should though, because that's where all rich people are. So you can swap that for the, you know, some kind of summaries of house sizes and incomes and whatever demographic stuff there is in those groups. If you wanted sort of like dummies, but not dummies that were each individual level, then you're back to like, how could I sort of group these guys in some sensible way? Which again, if you've got a target, you could do it based on the target. There's a Greenacre's correspondence analysis. It's the place to be. It's not Green Acres, it's one guy, Greenacre. But it's basically like, you could build a decision tree, and where this was your only input, and it would lump similar groups together. This is the last one. So I have a buddy who likes this approach where you kind of like take the actual performance in each group, but he's a closet Bayesian. He doesn't want people to know. So he smooths these values. So if this was like way higher than the average, he would kind of like smooth it back down towards the average. If this was way lower than the average, he would smooth it up towards the average a little bit. And the amount of smoothing that he does is a function of the sample size in each one of these buckets, which is a very Bayesian thing to do. So like, out of the Bayesian closet. So again, if you do that, then it's a number, you can dump it into a thing. It's simply, you get, I don't know if you always get, I haven't proved that this is mathematically the case, but like if you took, again, these values as your only input, and you fed it into some kind of modeling routine that was very flexible, like a neural network or something, and you did, like, you know, it's going to start out with basically all the parameters are pretty much 0, your model's not very interesting at all, and if you let it run forever, it will make all the parameters like some crazy wiggly value, and you get basically the training data logit in each, or the training data performance in each one of these buckets. Somewhere between, ignore the training data and memorize the training data is the Goldilocks level where you could pick some kind of smooth value there. I should run for Congress because you asked me a question And what I did was I started talking about something else, right? Like you want to know about what to do with these guys, and I started talking about this guy. But if it's just purely this unsupervised thing, then your probably best bet is to try and figure out some way to have that be a link to other data, and match to, if it's bank branches, right? Then okay, well let me go out to those branches and get information about those branches. Zip code, same deal. I said that was less than. Any other questions?
Can I make a suggestion for doing two things wrong? Since this is not legally binding at all.
Turn off the camera, quick.
Yeah, I don't want to be held accountable for this in any way. But there are two things that you could do that would be just fun to try if you've never tried them before. One, if you've got a variable that has the levels A, B, C, D, instead of using the levels, create another variable and essentially use the proportion of cases that are A, B, C, D as the level. So you could take let's say that you had 32, let's say you got 100 and you had 32 A's, you'd have anybody who responded A would then be recoded as 0.32. That's one thing that you could do. It's a little dicey, but you ought to try it just once, see how it comes out. The other one is to truly take every single one of the A, B, C, D, create 4 variables as 0, 1s, which is wrong because behind the scenes, while you're doing correlations and you're restricted the range of the variable, so we know it's wrong. But you can still run that through the analysis, and there's some interesting papers where people have shown that things like factor analysis are much more robust with respect to just binary inputs than maybe we would have once thought. But that may be a side effect of that particular data situation, all the rest. But if you're just playing with data and you're interested in seeing how it looks, it's fun to try both those things and just see how it comes out. It's like the old thing where you used to take a categorical variable and put it in rank order in terms of the likelihood and correlate it with a ratio variable and have students do that and find out that correlation, just doing a Pearson correlation against the ranking, is just about the same as the chi-square when they run it the other way around. And it's fun with numbers. This is like your banking friends. Don't do it with the banking friends. It's a whole different world, but it's a little fun just to play with the numbers and see, how they come out. It's a different way to kind of model it. But that gets the worst case of what you're saying, where the scaling is all fouled out.
Right.
The only purpose I would have in doing that would be to identify the variables that cluster together without a target, so that then you can maybe go back and maybe more manually create some kind of trait for it. But that's fun with numbers. I mean, especially if you're a student, you ought to be spending some portion of your time kind of goofing around doing something that your professors might not approve of.
Dan? Have you worked with random forest? And it seems that with PCA you were still making a lot of human decisions when I was expecting, well, things are just going to fall out because this is unsupervised variable selection, but it seems that random forest may actually give you less human effort categorization. And I didn't know if you'd worked with random forest or just PCA could opine about the relative.
Yeah, the only thing I know for random forest is in the supervised context, where using them with a particular target variable.
Okay.
But I heard Mark volunteer to give a talk on unsupervised random forests at some point in the future. Any other questions that need to be addressed far from margaritas, or do the rest of the conversation need to happen?